Give it one more minute. Ugh. Better if I don't know. Okay. Can I see your head? Dusum Sheja Gunjen Garma Ba Je Je Jong Je Jumba Ze Nam Dang Jen Da Za Suan Ba Den Ro Ba Zo Da Lan Ja 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 La Nga Nye Be Nyame Rogan Dambon Ganjala Sarwan Den Zoin Ganjala Manam Jumba Zeno Namda Jinjala Shen Lo Gom Ji Gang Ba Song Ba Shen Sen Nor Gun Lai Jai Jen Me Ba Dong Indiran Dun Dai Jen Be Gom Jen La Nyen Gora Jen Ba Me Ba Jen Jalo Me Gom Jen Go War Zon Ba Shen Engan Der Goi Jen Be La Ma La John Do Zor Wan Den Be Gom Jen La Chemen Me Ge Jawa Jin Jalob Ying Me Gom Jing Je Zon Ba Shen Jaran Dom Be Ngo Wo Zo Ma De Ma Chun Den Gara Jom Be Gom Jala Gom Jala Dom Jawa Jen Jala Nam Dong O Wo Chung Go Zom Ba Shen Yama Yen Jerian Jarwala Magaram Banjarwe Gom Jela Quarande Yermen Domba Jen Jela Jewa Gondo Yonda Lama Rame Jen Jemala Lon Jecheng Sadalam Jiyande Ranzone Jange Goma Nyorno Jo Sanje Chudong Zaje Janam La Janjumba Dane Gyamtso Je Dage Jinzo Je Bezunam Rola Benje Zanje Dromba Jo Zanje Judon Zanje Jonam La Jonjo Bado Dane Gyamtso Je Jembe Zunam Je Rola Benje Zanje Dromba Jo Zanje Judon Zanje Jonam La Jonjo Barado Dane Gyamtso Je Dange Jinzo Je Sunam Je Rola Benje Zanje Dromba Jo Senje Damje Dewa Don Dewe Ju Dembara Joje Dungal Don Dungal Je Jodan Rawara Joje Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Dome Rawara Ju Yering Shadan Yedam Rawe Donyam Jumbola Neba Joje Simjin Damje Dewa Don Deve Jodan Dambar Joje Dungal Don Dungal Je Jodan Rawara Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Dom Rawara Joje Yering Shadan Yedam Rawe Jambola Neba George Simjan Damje Dewa Don Debe Judan Dambara Dungal Don Dungal Je Judan Rawara George Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Dame Rawara George Nyering Chadan Yadan Raw Onyam Jambola Neba George Dada Simjan Damje Lo Chuzo Rawara Jinje Lamdo So Lamdo Rawara Jinje Lamdo So Lam Joba Sawara Jinje Lamdo Chulba Yeshe So Charwara Jinje Lamdo So Dada Simjan Damje Lo Chuzo Rawara Jinje Lamdo So Lamdo Rawara Jinje Lamdo Lam Chulba Sawara Jinje Lamdo So Izu Charwara Jinje Lamdo So Dada Zinjan Damje Lo Chuzo Rawara Jinje Lamdo Lamdo Rawara Jinje Lamdo So Lam Chulba Sawara Jinje Lamdo Chulba Yeshe So Charwara Jinje Lamdo So Dada Zinjan Damje Lo Chuzo Rawara Jinje Lamdo Lamdo Rawara Jinje Lamdo So Lam Chulba Sawara Jinje Lamdo Yeshe So Charwara Jinje Lamdo So Mojen Yojen Nam Jan Swambe Mages Nombola Yazen Jogging Adrenye Bema Jone Shiso Dragorando Gan Mongbe Gore Je So Dadrum Je Jin Je Lam Jesu zo nen jo de ro jem bo la ron jo da la wang jing geng da lo den ba je so jo dong dong ngan ron zo om a ho yam ben ra go ro ba ma je de hom Om Hum Benzra Gora Pema Da Cheng Za Benzra Samayan Zan Za Zarva Siddhi Bala Hum Arima Harenis Aryan Zindarem Brem Zan Zain Gora Gandra Zonje Daja Mebe Bona Lula Goye Jinja Lo Ngala Sunge Jinja Lo Yala Dongje Jinja Lo Wanje Korwara Jinja Jujen Dambara Jinja Lo Lamje Jombara Jinja Kujen Dambara Jinja Lo Oma Woem Benzra Gora Bemad Dai Gene Gaia Abe Kenza Om Maga Abe Kenza Tsinda me genza hom za wa ame genza re. Naomi, did you want to make an announcement about the questions?
Hi, everyone. I don't know why, but questions at kunzang.org has suddenly disappeared. I'll look into it later. So if you have sent questions to that, can you send it again to, and you'll see it on the website, naomigraphics1@gmail.com. And it's on the website under the teachings. You just click on that link there. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Good morning, everyone. We're continuing from where we left off yesterday. Yesterday morning we talked mostly about fear, and yesterday afternoon about anger. And this morning we're going to look a little bit at sadness. I'm running out of things to say, so basically I'll say what I have to say about this, and then if you have questions, I'll do my best to respond to them. And so we may finish up this morning. We may not, I don't know. Depends on. Now, one of the things that we explored a little bit yesterday was something of the relationship between the truth of suffering and the truth of the cause. And not to belabor the point, but before going where I'm going to go with this, I should probably just review the Four Noble Truths a little bit. When the Buddha first taught, he is said to have repeated the Four Noble Truths 3 times. And that first sermon, first talk, first lecture, whatever you want to call it, is said to have basically consisted of those 3 repetitions. The first is usually recorded as, and obviously translated into English, as the first noble truth is suffering. Now, noble truth here doesn't mean it's a truth that is wonderful and it means the first thing that is recognized by those who achieve what the Buddha referred to as spiritual nobility, which means the path of seeing, the first bodhisattva level in the Mahayana, and the roughly corresponding levels in the path of Ashravaka. So what you gain when you realize the path of seeing is an insight into the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And I'm not going to go through those. The one reason is that I've talked about those in the past, and that's not our topic. And the other one is I can't remember all 16, so it wouldn't be very good. In any case, he first said the first noble truth, the first thing, the first truth realized by those who achieve spiritual nobility is suffering. The second noble truth is its cause, the cause of suffering. The third noble truth is cessation, meaning the cessation of suffering, but through the cessation of its cause. And the fourth noble truth is the path. And then he said, we're told, suffering, the first noble truth, is to be known or understood. The cause of suffering, the second noble truth, is to be abandoned or let go of. Cessation, the third noble truth, is to be achieved or attained. And the path, the fourth noble truth, is to be relied upon or used in order to achieve that. And then the third repetition gets where I'm going with this. Other than suffering, nothing needs to be known or understood. Other than its cause, nothing needs to be abandoned or let go of. Other than cessation, nothing needs to be attained or achieved. And other than the path, nothing needs to be relied upon. Or you could say there is nothing else to rely upon. Now, when we were looking at fear, I mentioned, and many of you, several of you, clarified this through your questions, that fear, while based upon the truth of suffering, based upon self-fixation, the truth of the cause, is itself an example of the truth of suffering. Anger is kind of the opposite in the sense that it's primarily the truth of suffering. But the unpleasant feeling of anger, the suffering that anger brings during the moment, and especially the suffering that it brings as a long-term result, is the truth of suffering. Well, when we come to sadness, it's a little more complicated. And the reason for this is that if you look at the Four Noble Truths, they are the result and cause of samsara, and what we could call the result and cause of nirvana. Basically, there are, as traditionally stated in Buddhist teachings, there are two basic types of state. One is a state of affliction, and the other is a state of namjang, or purity. Now, the state of affliction, or kunyan momba, consists of both the resultant state itself, the state of suffering, and its cause, because obviously the cause of suffering is the kleshas and so forth. In the same way, the state of purity, or we could say purification, but it's better to say purity, is really the state of awakening, the cessation of ignorance and suffering, but also, in a sense, the path or the process that leads to that. What makes sadness different from fear, which is primarily a state of suffering and caused by the cause of suffering, and anger, which is primarily a cause of suffering but also includes suffering itself, is that sadness is not necessarily only a state of affliction. Now, this is very tricky to talk about because now I'm going to have to go way beyond my experience. And I'll be quoting His Holiness the 17th Jong Karmapa. When compassion is described, and people, and I'm relying here on my memories as an interpreter, which is basically what I am, right? Teachers will talk about compassion and so on, and students will often ask, but compassion, when I start to feel compassion, I feel so sad. I feel terribly sad. And most teachers will say, well, that's because you're still an afflicted sentient being, and once you achieve the first bodhisattva level, then your compassion becomes non-referential, and you have no fixation, so it's compassion but it's not sad. Now, they're not wrong, I'm sure, although this is obviously way beyond anything I know from experience. They're not wrong because it is by definition true that anyone who achieves the path of seeing has no fixation as we know it. When His Holiness was once asked about this, and I don't remember where this was, and yesterday I apparently mixed up Harvard and Yale, so I'm going to stop saying when and where because my memory is untrustworthy at best. I mean, you can mix up anything, but you can't mix up Harvard and Yale. I mean, don't ever mix up Harvard and Yale. For God's sake, don't mix up either of them with Princeton. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like mixing up Oxford and Cambridge. What His Holiness said was, it is sad. He said, real compassion is sad. He said, if there's no sadness, it's just lip service. That's not his word. He didn't say lip service, but he meant it's not real, it's not deep. Now, how do we recognize these two answers to basically the same question? I think that the sadness of a bodhisattva, which I would say is, you know, to speak in rough terms, is free of affliction. I mean, you could say bodhisattvas compared to Buddhas are slightly afflicted if you want, but not by our standards. Is free of some types of sadness and not free of others. Okay. And that's why talking about sadness is more complicated. It's very easy to say that anger is a klesha. It is. And it's miserable. You can't be happy at a moment of anger, and you certainly won't be happy when its karmic ripening arises. And fear, as we know it, is based primarily on self-fixation. So we can call it, you know, afflicted. Sadness is tricky. Sadness, choshi, the determination to be free, nijung, which I used to translate renunciation, but His Holiness, the 17th Jolon Karmapa, corrected me. Well, I wasn't interpreting, somebody else was, but he corrected all of us. And he said it would be better to say the determination to be free. Because renunciation implies what you give up, you know. I renounced playing Scrabble after 11 o'clock at night. Yeah, didn't quite. I may have gone to 11:30 last night. I don't know. But, you know, that's renunciation, giving something up. And don't forget, according to the Buddha, the only thing we need to renounce is the cause of suffering. But the attitude of nijung, which means a certain emergence or escape, you know, is the desire, the determination, really, to be free. And these terms in English I did not coin. I think I've stolen them from the Padmakara Translation Committee. Anyway, so hats off to them. The determination to be free, if you think about what it is, must involve some kind of sadness. Since that determination to be free is a necessary precursor to bodhicitta, and bodhicitta, we're told, is the cause of awakening, or the condition for future awakening, if you want to be picky. Therefore, we cannot say that the sadness, even as an ordinary person, we can't talk any more than I did, or I can't, about bodhisattva sadness, because it's just theory to me. But we cannot even say that the sadness of an ordinary person is totally a state of affliction, if it is an element in the determination to be free, which itself is the necessary precursor, and indeed a great part of bodhicitta. Because we're taught, I think it's in the Kunji Jilpo, the All-Creating King Tantra, that it says there are 3 types of determination to be free. And these are those of the common vehicle, those of the Mahayana, and those of the Vajrayana. And they're all, without Nijung, without the determination to be free, there is no Buddhist path. We can't avoid that. But, so, I think the difference would be how specifically you identify the cause of suffering. And, as an aside, when we're comparing different aspects or vehicles of Buddhism, it may be most helpful not to think of them as higher and lower, but to think of them as more and less specific or precise. Because if you carefully study the authentic Buddhist teachings, they don't contradict themselves that I've seen. Now, I haven't seen everything. I'm not a scholar. I'm really not. And so I don't know, but I haven't seen anything that in its true meaning contradicted anything else. Anyway, that's not our topic. So because sadness is not wholly afflicted, because it is so related to and so necessary for Ngejung, for the determination to be free, which is necessary for bodhicitta, which is necessary for Buddhahood, it's tricky. So we have to parse our sadness. We have to look at what it really is. For example, in the lineage supplication that we just recited, it says, as is said or as is taught, disgust. And actually, Pengar Jumbo Zombo uses the word shenlok, which really means disgust. Shenpa is craving or gusto, and lokpa is turning away from. So it's really disgust. It's almost, you can use shenlok sometimes to mean physical nausea. Wouldn't be the normal word, you'd say chogro, but you could. So similarly, disgust is a visceral sense of revulsion, and sometimes people do translate this revulsion. And we've all experienced that disgust. We're disgusted with this, we're disgusted with that. The problem is parsing our disgust. We have to peel it apart. Because if we are disgusted with the cause of suffering, that's according to the Buddha, healthy. Because disgust causes you to let go of something. If you pick up a peach and you notice that it's moldy, you'll let go of it. You won't put it in your mouth. You're disgusted. You don't hate the peach. You don't think peaches are bad. No more peaches. I'm never buying peaches again. This one was moldy, no more peaches ever. Forget it. You don't throw the peach at the wall. And you don't have to call up all your friends and say, I've given up peaches. No more peaches. Peaches are bad. Peaches are all moldy. Healthy disgust is recognizing that although peaches themselves are fine, like everything else, they're impermanent and they rot. And if you eat a rotten peach, you might get sick or discover some new antibiotic. I don't know. Probably not. So, in the one case where you flip out, oh, I spent so much money on this peach. I'm so angry. I hate peaches. And then you throw the peach at the wall, and then you have not only peach juice and a dent where the peach pit hit. I'm not literally describing something I've done, but I've done stuff like this. So, yeah, I can extrapolate. You have a peach pit dent maybe an indented peach pit in your wall. You've got peach juice, and not just peach juice, you've got rotten, funky, moldy peach juice. You just took a small problem, actually just a perspective problem. You didn't have a problem. Having that peach in your hand didn't cause you a problem. It was your reaction to it. Now that's unhealthy disgust, you know. And the difference is that in recognizing that to consume that moldy peach might make you sick, and therefore using it as compost, putting it in the garbage, whatever, is a sane response. The difference is between that, which is disgust with the cause of suffering, and disgust with the circumstances. Now, suffering itself, of course, is disgusting. It's disgusting simply because when we experience suffering that is not just the ongoing suffering that we tend to try to ignore and deny the existence of, when we experience suffering that we recognize as suffering, we feel disgusted. Literally, when I'm miserable, I can't eat. That's disgust. I mean, literally, my stomach seizes up and I have no appetite. But what's most important to be sad about, to be disgusted with, to be determined to become free from, is the cause of that suffering. Because it's not enough for me to simply say, oh, I'm so miserable, I'm tense, my stomach hurts, I can't eat today. That's not going to solve anything. It's not a solution. It's really just the acknowledgement of a symptom. Is it better than denial? Yes, but it's not enough. I have to look at, why am I miserable? What have I done that has made me miserable? So the first thing I want to say, and it's taken me a long time to say this, is we need to parse our sadness. Whether we call it sadness, joje, disgust or revulsion, shinlok, or the desire to be free, ngejung. And I would argue that ngejung is a more developed attitude than simple sadness itself. I think ngejung is a result of sadness. Okay. You know, I'm so pathetic with technology that I have this iPhone now, and you know the amount of pressure you have to, is it called the home button? See, I don't even know that. The amount of pressure and the duration of thing for, touch, the magic touch, is different on my two iPads, because I've got one for Tibetan and one for English for when I work, and the iPhone, so that I always, whenever I try to, unlock the iPhone, I hold it too long, and Siri recognizes that I'm just not capable of dealing with this iPhone. And so I always get, on that black screen, I get a message with little rainbow light. It's very pretty. What can I help you with? All right. So Siri, there's a lot, but for now, let's just, again, what can I help you with? Okay, I'm doing it. Yes, it worked. So how do we work with sadness? What do we actually do? Well, you remember that one of the things that we discussed yesterday was the common statement that impermanence is the key to understanding emptiness. I could say the analogous relationship an analogous relationship is between sadness and empathy. But again, it has to be, we have to handle the sadness in a creative and healthy way. An example that I often use that is, I would say near and dear to me, except I find it horrid, but it's certainly near to me, is that awful moment in the morning called shaving. I don't mind the experience of shaving. I like the smell of the shaving cream, and you know, unless I wound myself horribly, and I sometimes do because I'm not, you know, really careful. It's not physically unpleasant. It takes a moment, but you know, the problem is that to shave, I have to look in the mirror. Now, I'm not one of those who looks in the mirror unless it's absolutely necessary, because I don't like what I see. I am in denial of impermanence. And the proof, complete proof, is how I appear to myself in my dreams. I'm always younger than I am, and usually thinner. And sometimes I even have hair, although that's not always, you know. And that means that my habitual, because dreams are primarily habitual, or mine are, my habitual clinging, let's say, has not kept up with the passing of time, has not kept up with impermanence. So when I look at my face in that mirror, and I have shaved in, you know, in other countries when traveling without a mirror, and in retreat we weren't allowed to have mirrors, but you know, it's easier, right? So it's like a slap in the face, because all of a sudden I see that I'm much older, fatter, balder, more wrinkled, whatever, than my image of myself. And the affect of that, for me, is sadness. Now, there's a good thing about that and a bad thing. The good thing is that it's a reminder to me of impermanence, a reminder to me specifically of the fact that I am in denial of impermanence. Because if I were not in denial of impermanence, probably in my dreams I would look very much like the way I look in the waking state. The bad part, or the unnecessary part, is that I care. You know. Actually, one of the, and that's supposed to be, well, that can last for some time, but, so, sadness is a healthy response fundamentally to any message that reminds us of our denial of impermanence. But then, if we make it about us, then it becomes a state of affliction. So I would say that in the example of shaving, the first moment of shock, this is every day. I mean, there are days I don't shave, but mostly I do because I don't like the look. You can do the unshaven look if you've got like a very thick beard and you're young, but when you're 60, it's not on. For me, at least, anyway. The first moment of shock, that's, I think, basically healthy. It's a recognition, oh, I'm in denial. The second moment, where what I'm caring about is my appearance or my aging or my expectation of death and so on, because it's all about that, right? It's all about death. Aging is death. It's a slow death, and it may be sped up at some point by other factors such as violence, disease, the pandemic, anything. But fundamentally, well, if you're born, you're going to die. So, that's it. But what about if instead of responding to that sadness, that recognition of impermanence with selfish dismay, I respond with empathy? And I think that this option of being empathetic, more empathetic because of sadness, is equally available to us. So to separate healthy and unhealthy sadness, or you could say sadness that's useful to us on this path, I would say that healthy sadness is the recognition of how impermanence affects us all, and largely beyond our control. So, this weekend we're kind of focused on the pandemic. Even the word pandemic, pan means everywhere or everybody or something like that. And so we don't even call it an epidemic, we call it a pandemic because it's worldwide, it's everywhere. Given that that's what we're dealing with, among other things, but let's focus on that, why focus on ourselves? Because there are other people who are suffering far worse than most of us are. Now, I can say that because I am not at this moment actively ill. As far as I know, I don't have COVID. I've not lost my apartment yet. I'm obviously not starving. I have running water. I have an air conditioner. I have a car that more or less works, so I can get from place to place. And those closest to me are all apparently healthy. So my sadness about this, which is real, should not be, rationally, should not be about me. It should be about the people who have died, the people who are dying, the people who are sick but are getting better, the people who will never be able to pay the outrageous medical bills they've incurred through this epidemic, the people who've lost their jobs, the people who, although they may not be ill, are first responders and therefore at risk, and other essential workers. Those are the people I should be thinking about. The people that have to put themselves at greater risk than I do. In our abundance of caution here, we are ensuring that the lamas and staff and whatever we are, and we're all kind of staff, we're all kind of lamas at this point, I don't know who's what. Anyway, that we are not posing risks to ourselves or others because we can. We have that option. We're very, very lucky. I would say that probably 90% of the people on this planet, maybe 99%, don't have that option. They cannot make themselves as safe. We are living in a comparatively sparsely populated, comparatively, once you get out of Poughkeepsie, sparsely populated county in a state that has done really, really well. We've got this, below 1% infection rate among those tested. Hospitalization rate was the lowest since March 15th, yesterday. So we're doing really, really, in New York State, we're doing really, really well. But there are countless people who, through no fault of their own, are at tremendous risk. You know, and it could change. You know, I mean, look at New Zealand. I mean, they didn't have a case for like, what, 102 days, and then all of a sudden, and they don't even know how it showed up. So when we parse our sadness, rather than attempting to get rid of it, we should make sure that it's not about us, that it's about others. And this will have two benefits. The first benefit is that when we don't victimize ourselves, when we don't say, why me, we cut our suffering in half. If we're sad, if we're suffering, we're still going to suffer. This is not, I'm afraid, a magic bullet. But we will suffer less. Why? Because one major part of suffering is fear. I don't know how many of the people listening suffer from regular or occasional migraines, but I do, and I know that some of you do. And when I was a child, of course, they didn't diagnose migraines as widely as they do now. They thought they had to be bilateral, and now they know they don't. But anyway, there was no recourse. There was no Amitrex. There was no whatever you have. And when I would get these headaches, when I also got earaches and stuff like that, and I remember the suffering, and I remember the feeling was twofold, or there were two aspects to it. One was the pain, the horrible, nauseating pain. The other was the fear. It was the fear of the next moment, the fear of the continuation of the pain. So I remember one night having an earache so bad when I was probably 5 years old that I was lying there in the more or less dark, supposed to try to get to sleep, crying from the pain, and thinking, I can't live through this. If this goes on all night, I don't see how I can survive. Well, I did, obviously, more or less. So I think that when we suffer, both physically and mentally, half of it is the actual pain, mental or physical, and half of it is the fear of the continuation of the pain. So when we concern ourselves with others, not with ourselves, we lessen that aspect of it, and that's the immediate benefit. The long-term benefit, of course, is we become less selfish and... No.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
We weren't supposed to. I'm not doing dictation. I'm sorry. I'm having arguments with my phone. It's interesting, you know, I wrote these notes down last night, and those I did dictate, not to Siri, but to the, you know, the microphone thing. You press that, and then you get this, yeah. Sorry, I don't know the words for any of this. And when I wrote the thought, there's something wrong with the way I pronounce the English language, although the iPhone is better at understanding me than either of the iPads. I don't know if it's that I have a Canadian accent that the software designed for American English doesn't recognize, or if my enunciation is shoddy. But last night when I wrote, I meant to write, unhealthy sadness is the thought, why me? It wrote the fart, why me? So then I said, no, the thought, because sometimes if you repeat it, it'll figure out that that's what you meant the first time. So instead it wrote the fart again. So my notes say, unhealthy sadness is the fart, why me? And, well, that's just the story of my life. I mean, but the thought and the fart, why me, is unhealthy. You know, the mind training teachings talk about this. When we feel bad, we often find ourselves thinking, why me? You know, why is the universe doing this to me? If we personify the universe as though it's a conscious agent, which some people believe it is. You know, or we blame some particular individual. And that doesn't help. It just makes it worse. If instead we reflect upon how many other beings, people, are suffering in the way that we're suffering at that time, and that will alleviate the suffering. Now, we embody this principle, of course, in some of the Jataka tales, the tales of the Buddha's previous life. And there's one where, in a previous life, the Buddha was a merchant's son that wanted to go on a journey, and his mother didn't give him permission, so he kicked his mother in the head. And then he went on the journey, and when he got to the island of jewels, he'd reached what are called temporary hell realms or personal hell realms, and he got there, and everybody had blazing iron like buzzsaw blades, like table saw blades, landing on their head and slowly, you know, chewing through their brains and then going up and doing it again and again and again. And when he noticed, because he was already, I don't know if he was already an Arya Bodhisattva or just a prospective Bodhisattva, but anyway, when he noticed that he wasn't the only one having his brains pureed, he thought, oh, I wish that others didn't have to experience this, instead of thinking about himself. And then that immediately the buzzsaw blade lifted off his head and he was reborn in a God realm and so on. Now, whether you take this story literally or not, the principle is definitely true. Caring about others is the fastest means to happiness and contentment. Because trying to be happy ourselves is impossible. It's like what's the expression? Trying to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. You know, the more you worry, and I worry about my own happiness, obviously. I've been suffering from depression all my life. I'm obsessed with the issue of happiness. But the more obsessed I am, the more miserable I'm going to be. You know, a medication will help, but still, if I worry about how much I worry more. You know, and if you care about others, you can't care about yourself exclusively. Now, this doesn't mean that you become a doormat. It doesn't mean that you don't care about yourself, and it certainly doesn't mean that you don't take care of yourself. But it means it's not exclusive. It's not all about me, all about you. You know, you extend yourself beyond those confines. And the immediate result, of course, is you don't really have time to think about yourself all the time. Because you can't think two things at once. I'm either thinking, how are they feeling? Or I'm thinking, how am I feeling? I might be thinking, how are we feeling? But that's still better than how am I feeling? That's the immediate benefit. The long-term benefit is habit, as we saw yesterday. You know, habits accrue. That's what habit means. And so the more often we think about others, the more often we are going to think about others. Yes. So it seems that the practice of mind training, the same principle that I mentioned yesterday, the 3 objects, 3 poisons, 3 roots of virtue, is our best resource when it comes to learning to separate healthy and unhealthy sadness. Because as long as I'm just going to read what I wrote or dictated, and if there's farts, there's farts. As long as we are focused exclusively on our own individual suffering, we're helpless. We actually disempower ourselves. Since you can't make yourself happy by wanting to be happy, when you obsess with your own happiness, you are helpless. You're helpless to help yourself because you can't lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. And you're helpless to help others because you don't care about helping others. You only care about helping yourself, which you can't do. So you're really helpless. To put it brutally, when I think about myself alone, I am useless. That is useless. When I think about myself, my happiness, my well-being exclusively, I am useless to myself and I'm useless to other people. Now, if that's the case, then the opposite must also be the case. Because once we recognize that others are suffering too, and in many cases much more than we are, and that many of them have fewer resources at their disposal to deal with suffering, we will no longer be helpless. When we think about others, we become resourceful. First of all, we're less miserable ourselves, which makes us potentially much stronger, much more effective. Secondly, if you're really concerned with helping others, you will find a way to do it. Now, I don't want to obfuscate the necessary distinction between actively helping others, such as with social action and so forth, and just thinking about helping others. Obviously, these two things are entirely different, but they're not unrelated. I know from my own limited experience of thinking of others, because I do it very, very little, I mostly think about myself, that there are 2 different ways that I do it. One way is I'm actually thinking about thinking of others. And that's because I want to feel better about myself. It's totally self-absorbed. It's basically, I want to think about others today because then I'll feel better about being a Buddhist and I'll suffer less. My self-esteem will grow. That's totally useless. That's just fake. Well, I won't say it's totally useless because it might get you to think about others eventually, but it's kind of like throwing beans at a wall. One might stick, but probably not. The other way is when you actually think, what can I do? What can I do about this? How can I help? And if you're really thinking that, not just thinking you should think it, but if you're really thinking that, you will find something you can do. We all have different abilities. We all have different skill sets. There are many, many things that I am not good at. I won't list them because then we really would have no time for questions. And there are things that I don't have the guts to do. Those are 2 categories of things I'm not going to do. There are things I'm not good at, which I'm not going to do them because it's a waste of my time and others. And then there are things that I might be slightly helpful with, but I simply don't have the courage to do. Well, I have to accept that. It's humiliating, but it's true. There are things I don't have the courage to do that might be options. But there is a 3rd set of things that I have the courage to do and that I have reasonable ability, sufficient or satisfactory ability to be of some use, some contribution. And each and every one of us needs to make that assessment for ourselves as an individual. We can't simply preach, a specific remedy to things. We can preach social responsibility, you know, wear a mask, wash your hands, socially distance, you know, and if we did those things, as Dr. Fauci and others have said, then we'd be, you know, be doing much better. We can't force ourselves or others to do things that we're just not ready to do. But if we even did the things we are ready to do, that would make a tremendous difference. Socially, politically, and obviously in this context, medically. We may not be able to control events, but we can always influence them. And the reason why I say this is that as His Holiness, the Karmapa constantly, but often says, we're all interconnected. Everything that we think, say, and do has at least a tiny effect on the world around us. One of the questions that was asked yesterday, I think yesterday afternoon, was about vibes. And, you know, we don't use the word vibes as much as we did in the 70s. I guess in the 70s we talked about good vibrations and things like that. That's not totally wrong. When we are in that which means I'm habitually a jerk, people will know that even if I'm not in a, do we need to stop? Okay. Do you know where it stopped?
Yeah, I can, now it started again.
Okay. So if I'm a jerk, did it stop again? If I'm a jerk, which thinking, speaking, and acting selfishly, that's going to become okay. That's going to become inscribed in my personality. And because people are observant, at least unconsciously, they will detect that. We look at other people and we don't know what's going on within them, as we discussed yesterday. But we know that some people are kind of, I guess frightening might be the word. That does a couple of things. It drives away people who are positive, unless they are so strong that they can actually help us change. And it attracts people who are similarly negative. And that's how we create in society aggregates of selfish negativity. So even though we may not be in positions of social or political influence, we may not be leading research scientists who will come up with the vaccine for COVID, we may not be even community organizers or governors or mayors or senators or any of these things, we do have power for good or evil. Well, evil's loaded, it sounds supernatural. I mean, good or bad, to help or harm. So that means, first of all, that we have a responsibility, but beyond that, it means we have power. We cannot control events, but we can influence them. You know, we now use the term influencers. We're all influencers. Let's see if there's anything else here that's worth. Okay. That's it. Questions? No, I'm good. There's more. Thank you, though.
Yeah. So two questions. Well, I'll start from today, and then the question from yesterday I'll do at the very end. 'Cause
Okay.
It's off subject.
Okay.
Yesterday you talked about the four gurus and mentioned the symbolic guru of appearance and how it manifests now as everything falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about the symbolic guru of appearance? What is it? How is it that it manifests? How are we related to it? So, but how do we know if something we perceive is a symbolic guru of appearance or just something that we're perceiving?
I think that's a very good question. I think that at my level of experience, I can only talk about it in the most fundamental, basic sense of, for example, the world demonstrating impermanence, the ubiquitousness of suffering, and so on. There are other levels to it, and those are beyond my experience.
Okay, next one. Hello, Lama. I'm curious of which sutras the triple reiteration of the Four Noble Truths occurs in, and where any commentary literature upon them may be found in the Tibetan canon.
I don't know.
Okay. Next one. The desire to be free is what allows me to work in a jail. Moreover, I'm aware constantly of 1, my responsibility of alleviating inmate suffering, 2, my incomplete, limited abilities to do this. The only remedy is to continue to reach a state of Buddhahood. So it is a realization of my own limitations to helping others that make me want to practice. Because samsara is my nature, suffering in its infinite varieties. But I think
Is that a question?
I think it's a statement.
Okay, good. Well, I heard it.
I've run across a Bri Bu Jejung and a Sampe Nejung in Kunzang Lama Shelong.
Brebeuf. There was a Jean Brebeuf who was a Jesuit priest who came to the part of Canada that I grew up in. Are they asking about Jean Brebeuf? I don't think he's mentioned in Kunzang Lama Shelong.
But it wasn't explained. Do you know what these two kinds of Nejung imply?
Ngejong. Oh,
So,
this must be
Nejung
Justin.
and
Yeah.
Justin Phillips.
How did I know? Drebu Ngejung and yeah. That would be a good question for Lama Trotop. Why don't Justin ask him that the next time he teaches, because he's going to be talking about the determination to be free.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah, so you're just giving
Reference.
a reference that Lama Tratop will be teaching in October.
Yes. I think
Se-
the 17th and 18th or
Yeah, the
something like that.
17th and 18th.
Yeah.
You're the first guys to hear it.
Yeah.
All right, and this comes up in quite a few questions here. What about grief? Is grief a higher level of sadness? And a few people are mentioning grief.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, you know, people do use words slightly differently, even in a given cultural setting of a given language. But basically, I think that we use the word grief to mean intense sadness precipitated by loss of some kind. So higher level, I don't know what the questioner means by that, but it certainly would be an intensified, or, I mean, I guess we could define grief as acute sadness rather than chronic sadness.
Okay, the next one, and actually this is a good one, is it is sometimes hard for me to distinguish between my sadness and clinical depression. Any advice for dealing with depression in the context of this discussion of sadness?
Thank you for mentioning that, because that was one thing that I wanted to talk about and then I forgot. I think I mentioned yesterday that from about 1977, early in 77, end of 76, until 1990 at least, I never questioned my false belief that my chronic depression and dysthemia was the type of sadness that Buddhism teaches. So I can say from my own experience that it is very easy to fail to make that distinction. It's very easy to mix them up, and because I did it for at least 13 years, and I would argue I would give it around 20. And I still struggle with it. I still have to look. There are a couple of tools that we can use to peel these apart, to separate the two. The first assessment or analysis or scrutiny that I would recommend based on my experience is this feeling of sadness, whether it's the helpful sadness or the depression sadness. What action does it inspire? Every feeling suggests or inspires an action. The action may be doing nothing, but that's still a choice. Does it paralyze me or energize me? I think that's the first question. Because in my experience, anxiety, depression, for me, as I mentioned yesterday, they're two halves of one thing, paralyzes me. The only way in which it's, and I hesitate to use the word energizes me, is if when the OCD is full-blown and uncontrolled, it will cause ritual behaviors, which are not the same as Buddhist ritual behaviors. Because Buddhist ritual behaviors, you believe, have some kind of spiritual value. The ritual behaviors that you engage in through true obsessive-compulsive thinking, you know are unconnected in any way to the result. So, for example, my type of ritual behavior would be, unless I move this napkin toward me and back and in a way that nobody sees, something bad will happen to so-and-so. That's not Buddhist ritual behavior, you know. So the first question I ask myself in these situations is, does this feeling make me more or less motivated? And if it seems to cause me to do things, are those things, well, let's just leave it at that. Does this paralyze me or energize me? The second thing is that you have to get to know your depression. And this took me a long time. You have to actually be able to recognize the thoughts that are produced by the illness. So I've learned, and I'm not by no means perfect at this, I'm not claiming anything like that, but I've learned to usually be able to tell the difference between a thought that is appropriate sadness, or appropriate concern, for that matter, and a thought that is just the loop because the wrong receptors in my brain are firing. So those would be the two things that I would recommend.
Thanks. Can you discuss, well, it is, can you discuss how to deal with grief? So,
Well, that's a bigger.
yeah. And
bigger.
and then someone else says, the Lama would address grief, sadness, grief are not the same. Grief feels like an organic condition. That what are the teachings that might improve comfort to the grief-stricken? I have not been able to think of my way out of this deep sense of loss, the breathtaking sense of sorrow that overthrow me when I think about my dead child. What remedy for this?
Yeah. One of the key words in your question is breathtaking. I've experienced grief. I have not experienced your type, or I would argue your degree of grief. But I've experienced grief so intense that I felt literally that I could not breathe. Obviously, I was able to, or I'd be dead. I wouldn't be here. But I've experienced it a couple of times. And over things far less, actually, than the death of a child. And the reason I mention this is that in my experience, sometimes my grief is not only about what I am consciously grieving. Now that's very, very different from the death of a child, even the death of a parent or sibling. I've not experienced the death of a child, but I have experienced the deaths of parents and siblings and others I loved. I really hesitate to suggest spiritual remedies for this level of grief, because I think the danger of what's called a spiritual bypass, where you don't deal with real issues in our lives by sealing them with spiritual concepts and pretense, which are basically just distractions. I think that's very, very serious. Because I know I've done that. I mean, I did that with my depression for almost 20 years. So what I'm going to say is kind of brutal, and it's what I've said to myself about various things that I've grieved. The first is, it's two things. The first is about the passing of time. Eventually, over time, the grief is there. It's always there. but I won't say you make friends with it, because that sounds too trippy to me, too glib. But to say you get used to it is too watery. It really, as time goes on, it kind of becomes part of you. And that can be just habitual thinking, but I think that it just becomes part of you. And the second thing that's and and this is the brutal part, you have to accept that no, I think I don't want to say that. I want to stop there. This is too real. I mean, it's like I can't, without knowing the particular situation of the particular person, and given the situation they've described, I don't think I should go further with that.
Okay, I'm even teary-eyed. So she was going with you talking about the fear of pain. She says, yes, it reminds me of labor pain. You fear the next contraction.
Well, that I can't speak to,
Yeah.
because I've witnessed it, but I've never undergone it, and the two are as different as ham and eggs.
I have, for a reference, applied the remedy of heaping all sorrows into my sorrow, as well the remedy of watching the emotions to see from whence it came. I'm not sure how to find comfort.
So the questioner has tried these things and they didn't work?
Yeah.
Okay. Then,
And this is the same one who's lost a child.
the next remedy that I would suggest is to, if it's possible, to actively help others who've experienced that same loss. If you know people or can access people, whether it's a support group or something, that what's important is you can never really get rid of grief. I mean, I don't want to say that in the Buddhist sense of it, because everything's impermanent, blah, 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 but you can't try to get rid of your grief. You can't. It'll make it worse. If simply sometimes contemplating taking on the sorrow of others, the grief of others through terrible loss, is simply just not real enough. It's not intense enough to match the intensity, or even come close to, even inhabit the same ballpark, let's say, as the intensity of your own grief. So in that case, actually working with people, actually doing some form of outreach where you help others who have experienced the same type of suffering you have experienced, that may, I hesitate to say help, but it may be a good thing.
Okay, so this afternoon, but are we going to have this afternoon?
Well, let's see. We've got 40 minutes left now, so let's see how we
Okay.
do.
Well, maybe you can talk about the experience of wonder and faith and vibes in meditation. I can realize that my clinging to a certain fixed version of the future, which is determined by desire and aversion, is what's bringing suffering. If I can relax this, I experience wonder. I call it wonder because the experience of what arises has the complexity and uniqueness and beyond words, almost the quality of a scent of a taste, and it is never the same. This experience reveals the impoverished nature of samsara, even at its best. I attribute this realization to the blessing of my guru and the reinforcement of my faith. I find that this wonder actually allows me to practice the 6 parameters without much struggle, as is this true or is this a false reassurance? Also, how do I work with this beyond repeating over and over and making it a habitual, such that this recognition is a guiding principle of my life?
Well, first of all, I think that you've described with remarkable clarity a very positive development. The issue you raise at the end of your question, and there's nothing I can say that would actually even come close to the clarity you've used to describe what you're experiencing. The issue you raise at the end of your question about clinging, you can't cling to it because you're not going to be able to hold on to it, you know. So if you try to cling to things, you'll be holding on to a memory. And at this point, you probably sounds like you're sensitive or trained enough not to do that. You know, when we talk about clinging to experiences, it's really talking about if you get into some really deep state of bliss or lucidity or non-conceptuality, and you die in that state, that you might be reborn as a this, that, the other thing, whatever it is. But in our world, what we are experiencing is, as you said, an almost sort of kaleidoscopic variety of emotional, spiritual, and other states and experiences. And so it doesn't sound from what you're saying that you're in much danger of actually clinging to it, partly because you're questioning it.
Okay, so Justin says, Bray Boo?
Jean Brébeuf? No, he means Drebu.
Yeah.
Drebu Ngejung and Jui Ngejung. Again, that's a good topic to ask Lama Trapduk during his teaching.
Next question. I appreciate what you said about finding what you're able to do with the combination of your abilities and your courage. It seems that many of the precautions that I knew are doing precisely that. I think it's a statement.
Okay, nice.
When we see someone refusing to do anything to help themselves and blaming others for their suffering, this is an adolescent, how can we help them take responsibility and action?
When we see someone refusing to help themselves and what?
Blaming others for
Blaming
their
others
suffering.
for their suffering.
But it's an adolescent.
Again, I think that, you know, there are three things here. The possibility of a particular affliction, you know, like in my case, OCD and other things. That's one issue. Second is the state of adolescence, which is very, very difficult because of hormonal and other physical and brain changes. It's a very turbulent and difficult time for most people, it seems. Certainly was for me. And the third thing is that that's what most people do. Most people do that. They don't actually help themselves and they blame others for their suffering. So you would need to distinguish between whether it's an illness, simple adolescence, or basic human samsara. And the response would differ. You know, if it's a psychiatric or therapeutic issue, then it requires psychiatry and/or therapy. If it's simply the state of adolescence, I don't know if there's a solution except, you know. I mean, there is, you know, of course, there are excellent adolescent therapists. I mean, therapists who treat adolescents. I don't mean adolescents who are therapists. And, you know, I know of cases where they've been very, very useful. So that would be the second option. And then the third thing is if it's not really caused by the adolescence, by the age, and there's no mental illness, then it's samsara. And if the person's willing to listen, you can basically explain on a very, very basic secular level without religious propaganda what's going on. And if they won't listen, then pray for them.
And so, sorry, the last one where I appreciate about finding combination of your ability and courage. This is the second part of that. For myself, I fall in the category of being an essential medical worker, which I always attempt to bring my greatest empathy and care to. I usually come home fairly exhausted each day and am disappointed in myself that I'm not doing more socially or politically. It is just a matter of pushing myself harder. I wasn't quick enough in getting my entire question in one go, is what you're saying.
Well, anyone who is working now under these current circumstances as an essential medical worker is a hero. I mean, the people in the post office are heroes. So I think it would be overly hard on yourself to try to make yourself do more. Because this is going to last for a while. We don't know how long, but it's going to last for a while, maybe a long while. And, you know, at the risk of, I mean, screw the risk. I think we need to be gentle with ourselves, especially first responders, essential workers, because, you know, a non-essential worker, as a non-essential worker, I can say this, we are asking you to risk your lives for us. That's a lot. You know, I think that's everything. We are asking you to risk your lives the way we ask the military to do so, the way we ask others who put themselves at risk for the sake of others. And what more could anyone ask of you than that?
All right. Sadness, in my experience and observation, can lead to staunching activity, thought and a dwelling in one...
Staunching? What's staunching?
That's what she said. I didn't...
Can you spell it?
Staunching.
That is staunching.
Yeah,
That's
see,
a word.
I said it correctly.
Yeah, but I don't know what it means. Staunch to me means courageous, resolute.
I would say fixed, yes, staunch.
Or, yeah. So,
and now I've got a thought and a dwelling in oneself that may lead to inactivity. Suggestion for turning the not to do into do. So, for turning the not do into do.
Maybe by staunching, the questioner means repressing or causing stopping.
Oh yeah.
Stanching. Maybe that is the right use of the word. I'm fascinated. So the question was, sadness and depression can lead to less action?
So, all right, sorry.
How do you turn the impulse not to do anything into an impulse to do something?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, staunching. Now it's ringing a bell. Um, the only thing that helps me when that becomes a problem is sincere prayer. You know, I think that prayer and aspiration, which are distinct things, you know, in Buddhism, but go together a lot, are very important in times like these because they. One of the things that I'm experiencing is a sense of powerlessness. You know, I feel at times that I'm powerless to do anything about the things that are going on. Let's just say the things that are going on, including, you know, the pandemic. But we all have the aspiration, we all have the possibility, excuse me, of supplication or prayer and aspiration. Now, many Buddhists are very careful to make a distinction between the two. Supplication is asking for something, usually for blessings. And aspiration is making the aspiration to be able to do things yourself in the future. But we often put the two together, and I don't think that's a coincidence. For example, at the end of the Guru Rinpoche practice, on the 10th day, we recite a prayer and aspiration that's called, I think, the Song of Samantabhadra in English. And most of it is prayer, if you look at it. It becomes an aspiration at the end, because the aspiration at the end punctuates and specifies what you're praying for. You're praying for the circumstances and which facilitate and the achievement of Dzogchen realization. But why, if it is an aspiration, and we know that we're encouraged to think of it as an aspiration because we do it at the end of the practice, you know, after the dedication. If we thought of it as a prayer, like a lineage prayer, because it is a lineage prayer, we would do it at the beginning. So why do we do it at the end, not at the beginning? Because all of that prayer to the lineage, starting with Samantabhadra and down to our root guru, is a summary of all of the virtue, hopefully gained during those 2 hours of practice. And then you seal it by dedicating it to this ultimate realization. So therefore, I would say, based on the proportion of prayer to aspiration in that, which is one of our two most significant aspiration prayers done on a monthly basis here, that it's evident that the combination of the two is particularly powerful. Boy, I'm really waving my hands a lot today.
Yeah. All right. So I know I didn't tell people, but I've got to tell you now because you'll see this is Justin again. Is there natural progression from Koshi to Shenlok to Nunjung?
Well, natural progression to me entails effortless, automatic. And I would say no. I would say Choshe needs, sadness needs to be properly directed. I think that was what we were talking about earlier, making sure sadness does not become self-obsession. Properly directed toward Ngijung, the determination to be free, which itself we want to become bodhicitta. You can't have bodhicitta without Ngijung, and you can't have Ngijung without sadness. But sadness alone is not the determination to be free, and the determination to be free alone is not bodhicitta. Now, this is why I like the translation, again, I think what came from the Padmakara Translation Committee, of Ngijung as determination to be free. That's more than the desire to be free. And that's their determination is the translation of nge, certain, determined. Choshe, sadness, is not a determination, it's a feeling. If I just feel sad, I'm not determined. If I work with sadness in a constructive, creative, healthy way, it becomes a good determination. That's the determination to be free.
Okay. What would it look like to actually apply mind training to the experience of struggling with body dysmorphia or intense body dissatisfaction, which seems heightened in these times? What can we do?
Body dysphoria, did they say?
No, dysmorphia.
Dysmorphia. Okay. Well, I think that we experience a great deal of, well, I don't know this, but I suspect that we experience more dysmorphia in this culture at this time than our ancestors and other humans did in the past. Because I think in the past, we were primarily concerned with survival, as most people are. The struggle simply to have enough to eat and have a roof over your head and not be deprived of the means of feeding yourself. Dealing with warfare and invasions and oppression and disease with very little medicine that actually, at least in some parts of the world, that did much. I don't think that people become obsessed with their body image or their form under such circumstances. And I think that we've reached a state where even though we are at risk of disease, oppression, warfare, violence, killing, and an almost society-wide dysthemia, worldwide maybe in some cases. Even though we're at risk of these things now, we still are in the habit of, in this culture, culture is because, America's more than really one culture, but in this country, let's say, because of media, because of advertising, because of the movies, television, we have these standards. There used to be a saying, I'm a little fat, so I can talk about that. There used to be a saying, I think it was in the 90s, maybe it goes back to the 80s. I missed the 80s. I was in retreat, so things that I think of from the 90s were probably from the 80s. You can never be too rich or too thin. That used to be a saying. I would argue that you can be too thin because people do die of actual starvation. But we think that because we have this, image of everyone trying to look like a Hollywood celebrity. And it's severe. Now I mention that's probably the questioner knows this, but I mention it just because there is a specific context to our dysmorphia that is I imagine unique because of our level of social, wealth. whatever. We're not necessarily wealthy, though, to have that. So the Lojong teachings, the mind training teachings, don't specifically deal with this issue. They don't address, none of the 7 points actually deal, that I can tell, with dysmorphia. The closest they come to it is in the section of the commitments of mind training. One of the lines is Yenlak Nyampa Jumija, don't speak of injured limbs. And this means both speaking of physical injury or whatever on another person's part, and also speaking of their faults, their defects. So we can probably infer from that, since His Holiness has said that whatever you should not do to others, you should also not do to yourself. The compassion starts with compassion for yourself. That we should not beat ourselves over the head over our appearance. As for how to actually transcend the level of dysmorphia that we deal with now, I mean, in many social circumstances that I've experienced, that's all we talk about. Oh, I'm getting so old. I mean, I talk about that, the shaving thing, and, I'm so fat, I'm so old, I'm so bald, blah, blah, blah. We're obsessed with this. And so it's a heavy burden for us to bear. The only thing I can suggest in practical terms is think about others, not in the sense of compare yourself to others, but think about the fact that everybody is dealing with this. And one of the late night, we call them comedians, but actually they, if I may say this, tell more truth and actual news than the news does. So I hesitate to call them comedians because it sounds disrespectful, although they are occasionally very, very funny. One of them said that part of the problem is that we are subjecting ourselves to social media which create an illusory, and I'm not using names of specific apps or anything like that because, but we subject ourselves to images on social media that create a completely false sense of the way most people live and look. Because people don't post images on social media where they can post images of themselves having a bad time, eating a bad meal, first thing up in the morning. Well, some people do, but they're exceptional. Everybody wants to look their best and look as though they're having the most fun. Now, this has changed a little bit during the current time of pandemic. But basically, if you spend too much time as this late night comedian, social commentator might be a better word, pointed out, if you spend too much time filling your head with these false images, you subject yourself to an unreal and impossible standard. Anyway, yeah.
Okay. I visit the hole sometimes now, and it doesn't suck me in as it did before. I offer kindness and attention. She's just mentioning that question.
Oh, okay, good. Hold on, I've got a red light here. We didn't lose anything though yet. Okay.
Oh, so, I mean, I just think that somebody mentioned that body dysmorphia is considered to be on the spectrum of OCD.
Yeah.
Should I read that aloud when
we go back.
yeah.
Especially if it's an obsession with little things.
Yeah.
Naomi, are we back?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So
we're
can
back.
you repeat what you just said?
Okay, so I'm going to go, even though it's before, but it's answering your question. Somebody's mentioning body dysmorphia is considered to be on the spectrum of OCD.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Then going back to the question of staunching, she's saying it means it's stopping.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
stanch blood.
Yeah.
I didn't know it had a U. I've probably been misspelling it.
And then it looks like one more question. What would you say about the use of anger as an antidote to the feeling of helplessness and being a victim, like the story of the Count of Monte Cristo, a juicy story? Oh, and then I've got one more here.
In the Count of Monte Cristo, doesn't he destroy his enemy utterly?
Yeah.
I haven't read it.
Yeah, he
I
does.
don't know if that's quite a good example for a Mahayana practitioner. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't sound like it, but okay.
All right, now I'm going back to actually a question from yesterday, but it's just, I remember you telling us that Bharatuka Rinpoche and Lama Tratub had restored your faith. Can you share some stories?
Yeah, and this we're going to end with this, and I guess then we're done. It's actually very simple. Spending time with both of them has constantly brought to mind, this is an ongoing thing. It's not like a one-time event, although I'll mention a couple of specific circumstances. Has constantly reminded me of I'll use the word genuineness or authenticity, because where I get fouled up, and this is not a criticism of anyone else, this is about me. Where I get fouled up is with the disparity between my spiritual aims and goals and my actual state. And sometimes that causes me to lose hope, to believe, well, I'm never really going to get anywhere. I'm never really going to, become the type of person I want to become. And so, in an ongoing sense, both Bharata Rinpoche and Lama Tratub, not only them, but those two have been extremely, well, the word helpful doesn't sound strong enough, but let's use it anyway, extremely helpful in serving as regular or constant reminders of genuine spiritual growth and achievement. In terms of specific circumstances, there were really two events that among others, one was when many, many years ago, it must be like 18 more years ago, Bharata Rinpoche suggested that I translate the Precious Essence, the autobiography of Terchen Baba Dorje, the inner autobiography. And when I read that, I mean, before translating it, I had to read it, right? That helped tremendously because I was reminded that there were, and therefore are, more than 2 or 3 really enlightened people. Because it's, well, yes, there's His Holiness Dalai Lama, there's His Holiness Karmapa, there's His Eminence Sutta Rinpoche, and then it's very easy for us just to think, yeah, but they've been enlightened since like the dawn of time. Well, so is Barwa Dorji in a sense, but it just helped me tremendously to realize that there's just more than, there's more of them than I thought. Specifically, what inspired me about that was his relationship with Guru Rinpoche and Yeshe Tsojo. And that helped. The second thing that connected with Lama Trotop was he lent me the autobiography of one of his teachers, Khenpo Achu. And Khenpo Achu was the founder, I believe, and certainly the leader, spiritual leader of the Yachen, the Yachen community in Far Eastern Tibet.
Can you talk a little louder?
Louder?
Yes.
Okay.
Saying sometimes you're inaudible.
Okay.
My compressor died, so we're not getting that great audio.
Okay. Anyway, I'm almost done. I wasn't surprised by the Khenpo Achu's description of his own experiences and realization, or those of his teachers, because I expect that. But I was pleasantly surprised, I would say astounded, by the realization achieved by many of his disciples. And he included letters that he received from them and accounts of his personal dialogues with them and how they made progress. And what I realized when I read this was that the notion that I often have that, well, in the old days, Yeshe Tsogyal and Milarepa achieved enlightenment, but now we're too distracted, we're too degenerate, we're too lazy, we're too busy, and so on. To do that, the best we can do is pray for, realization, some future life. That's wrong. There are people right now living in very difficult circumstances, who are achieving what I think of as ultimate realization. And that helped me. So those were the 2 things. On that auspicious note, I think we could conclude. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As we're concluding for the day, we'll chant the full dedication. Sonam deye damje zengpa nye done nye beranam damje ne jenga na jemba la jomba ye simben zole rowa join kewan de ye je wo gozenam ye je zonzo sana ye je le jonwe damba gonye damba joy chanjo zemne remboje ma jemba nam je jor je jemba nyamba me bat ngondo ba wa ro sem je dam je de don den jor je ngen ro dam je do do dom ba jo Janjo Zamba Ganda Zajomba Dedan gunje malandro bajo. Sangje ringje zezin tampengar. Chagun duja don do lingbai. Samje me jong rebu song ju. Sije zhong dara chabe da ji. Thank you.